To give you a little bit more of an idea, I'm originally an analytical chemist, and you go, what the heck are you doing here? Well, through a series of kinks in the career, I went from working in the clinical diagnostics area to assay development to instrument software validation, and then as coming out of that, a merger in a company that turned out to be a buyout. I had to figure out what I was going to do when I grew up. So I became a quality manager and served in that capacity for 6 years at a company up here in Cambridge. Five of that time frame was in the clinical trial data management area. So I've been working both in clinical trial data management as well as the medical device field. And we've got other people who are in the clinical trials area, and I don't know if he's here this evening. I don't see him right now. I've been working on my own hook now for a good 13 years. The reason for the word Shoe Bar Associates, my wife's maiden name is Barzak. And when she was working across the highway here in Bedford at a company in the clinical trial data management field, she used to have to host audits where people came in from a pharmaceutical company. But how does the pharmaceutical companies do quality audits at a software company? They rent an auditor. So she would have people coming in from the pharma company accompanied by some consultant who was trying to prove him or herself in front of their own client. And she'd come home rolling her eyes at the ceiling. My God, Brian, you wouldn't believe the idiot we had in today. You know 10 times more than he does. You should be out there doing this. So her name has got to be part of the company name. I've been active in the software validation field in Part 21 CFR Part 11, which is the Electronic Records and Signatures regulation, and in software quality systems auditing and training for this period of time. And I have to say, one of the most interesting interesting exposures I've ever had was the time that I came over to Nancy's place to see some work they were doing with an evaluation board, doing some demonstration, and where they were doing essentially TDD. They were developing a test, and then they developed the code to make that test pass on this embedded system. And a light came on, because I was so used to managers complaining and complaining and complaining. Why is this quality stuff? Why do we have to deal with that? That's just a drag. We do it at the end anyway. If we have to cut anything, we cut down the testing. Who knows that situation? Well, what Nancy was showing me turned the light on, because I said, this is the answer to that age-old problem. What she's doing is value added. So I came on board with the Agile concept from that point. However, the traditionalists in the quality field still give that response of Agile won't fly here. So let's take a look at that. In the medical device field, over a period of 2007 to 2013, out of the total number of recalls, we talk about 6,800 some unique events, because a recall might be listed several different times for different models of a device or whatever. And of those, 1,678 are computer related, and of the computer related ones, 64% are software related. So there's definitely an issue going on in the quality in the software field for medical devices. 18 million medical devices are affected. And we look at it in a different way. There are 3 different classes of recalls. Class A, Class 1, Class 2, and Class 3 type of recalls. Most commonly are the Class 2 recalls. Class 1 are the ones of severe impact. Class 3 are the ones that are very low impact. Software is far and away the leading cause of any of the Class 2 recalls. And the number of recalls is growing. So we got an issue going on, and that's been going on for a number of years. Why do I think the Agile is an answer to that? Well, classically, development in the regulated field is very document heavy. It's very expensive and slow. Now, there's a lot of reason to take things carefully and slowly, but that doesn't mean that it can't be speeded up and still retain quality. Regulatory bodies are, of course, concerned about safety. If you have an implant of some sort and it shocks the person excessively, causing pain rather than reducing pain, or if you have a device which does something, administers excess radiation when it's supposed to be administering radiation that kills a tumor, well, you can have a definite impact on somebody's health or even kill them. The classic belief is you have to have processes that are tightly controlled. Therefore, why not look at a process that's controlled in a different way, but is highly productive? However, the kind of productivity that's in Agile seems to be an antithesis of a tightly controlled process. Well, this is what the rumors are. The standards say we got to follow a waterfall model, or Agile can't be used for safety critical work, which I take issue with all of these statements. And there's the true Agile says you don't plan and you don't write documents. I beg to differ. And then there's the kind of catch-all, this Agile stuff, that's just an excuse for sloppiness. So, is there a contradiction? There's a field where things are supported by documentation, they're regulated by the FDA, they have to meet ISO standards, and people have to get CE marks. But then there's this field that you folks are all very familiar with. Is it a contradiction? Not necessarily. But documentation and risk management are the crucial differences. And so what I want to focus on here is, what do you need to do in a regulated environment to make the stuff that you already are familiar with work out and work well? One of the first things is you got to recognize there are new stakeholders. In the classic environment, we normally put big circles around to show that there are cycles going on, but this is going to be too busy if I try to do that. Building the thing to make sure you have interaction between customers and team, your regular demos, and then interactions between your team and your code and hardware and all the rest of that. Those are management practices. The others are technical practices. Recognizing that there's another stakeholder called the regulators. Now, in 2012, a number of people, members who had originally put out the Agile Manifesto, people from the medical device industry, and people from the FDA got together and wrote this document and said, guys, the two are not incompatible. Covering key concepts and practices. TIR 45 is something I keep referring to. I did, however, hear a major quality manager, quality regulatory manager at one of my clients at a conference someplace say, yeah, I know that TIR 45 thing. I really don't know what they're going to do with that. This Agile, so she didn't get it. There needed to be something more that said, how do you go about doing this stuff? So Nancy and I got together originally in last February and said we've got to put together the thoughts that we've been presenting in book form. So that's the book that we came out with in June, Agile Methods for Safety Critical Systems, a primer, because we really only get into the basics here, a primer that uses medical device examples. There are topics in that book that I'm not going to get into this evening, and there are topics that I'm going to be talking about this evening that may not be covered in quite the same way in the book, but this is really a book talk. One of the key things that is not a common thinking practice in the typical software industry is this concept of risk management. When I talk about risk, I'm not talking about risk that your product's not going to work. I'm talking about the risk that you're going to hurt or kill somebody. That's the sort of risk, safety risk, that is absolutely paramount and is the very first thing on somebody's mind when they review an application for clearance for a medical device. And it has to be integral with the working that you're doing. Well, I've heard people say at conferences, software never hurts anybody. I hear enough of that here. What's the software safety hazards? What are some of the sources? Yeah, you can have direct failure, errors in logic or errors in branching and so forth. You can have misuse that you permit. That is somebody making a wrong selection and not being told, hey, wait a minute, that's not a good idea. You could have people being complacent about what they're doing in the software, which is kind of related to the last one, or confusion in the user interface. Notice I'm talking about something that we call human factors at this point. That is not the same as the concept of UX. User interface design to please somebody is great and wonderful, but user interface design that keeps them from doing something unsafe is part of the risk management process. And of course, there's security vulnerabilities and the sharing of protected health information, and now we've got the global data protection regulation and so on and so forth. So, incorrect algorithms, yeah. No checking of input. How about inadequate warnings? How about no validation or poor validation as opposed to verification? Validation where you actually test something with end users as to check to see that the UI design is effective, or attention to security. Those are the kinds of things that we need to be aware of when we're talking about risk management in a software-driven circumstance, whether it's a device, a mobile app, or some kind of piece of standalone software. And I've dealt with all three. So who should be involved in helping evaluate for safety-related issues? Let's have a show of hands. I mean, clearly the people who design should be involved. Any other ideas?
Regulators?
Regulators, absolutely. They've seen other devices that are similar to what you're building and saying, yeah, we've seen this other issue someplace else. End users. How are we going to, we don't normally do it that way. That's not the sequence that we would follow. That you could do something wrong there. Insurance companies, that's a nice idea. That ties in with regulators. The people who are going to actually reimburse for a device. I don't happen to have that on this list. How about physicians or nurses? That was what you were going to say. And this slide was from something I was talking about, TENS, that I'll bring in later on. TENS is transcutaneous electrical nerve stimulation. How about researchers who work on the area that particular medical device is dealing with? You get the idea. So there should be a large number of different viewpoints involved in that risk management activity. And by the way, one of the key mistakes that companies have classically made under a waterfall type of situation is they do their risk management fairly early in the process and then stick it on the shelf and let it gather dust. Well, you're used to requirements which are early, preliminary, and approximate requirements. They call them user stories. I mean, to me, that's the same thing, which get refined as you go along, and they become refined, detailed, and specific. Well, the same thing should be happening with the hazards and their mitigations, the things that you do to try to prevent something from happening as a result of a particular kind of hazard. So, and even if you look at the international standard ISO 14971 that talks about risk management, it says a company should establish, document, and maintain throughout the product development life cycle an ongoing process for analyzing, evaluating, and mitigating risks.
Yeah, just one other I wanted to add, which I've only seen once, is doing a legal review or looking for case law for things related to that kind of device to see what has gone horrendously wrong.
And a good regulatory affairs consultant would know when that kind of thing should be done.
Okay.
So let's take a look. Can we determine anything about product risks before we carry out design? Well, if we've got something, I was supposed to have that slide in here. Transcutaneous electrical nerve stimulation applies an oscillating electric field to the skin by gel-type electrodes, which brings about a pain relief. And it's complete mystery to me why this is effective, but it is. It turns out to be very effective in certain cases. If you see Shaquille O'Neal on television talking about the icy hot turn it off device, that's a TENS device. There are other examples. But If we talk about putting an oscillating electrical field right on somebody's skin, there's a possibility you could shock the person. You could, if you really went too far, you could burn a person. You could cause a spasm if it's on the neck or above, or you could cause some other device to fail. Well, we won't be able to explore too much about those last two possibilities, but over here, I think, yeah, if we have something shorted and an excessive current, we could bring about a shock. If you've got too much energy delivered, you could either run too long or set too high. And there are cases where either of the two, if things are set too high, there's a classic case where there's a use error. Notice I say use and not user error, because user error is blaming the person who's using it. Use error is something that you allowed to happen as a developer, as a designer. So let's collect those together. The excessive current and excessive impedance cases are kind of the flip sides of each other. And setting something initially too long is another case. A third case would be you increase the duration of treatment while it's going on. And a fourth case would be just plain use error. So what can we do about those even before we've come about designing a device? Well, we can write user stories and code them in such a way that they're recognizable as risk-related user stories. As a caregiver, in all cases, I want to ensure that therapy will stop if there's a short and open circuit or high impedance to avoid harming the patient. And so on through several other kinds of user stories. Now, is this kind of process ever complete? I mean, I talked about that a moment ago. Do we know enough about hazards when we're starting out to design a device? No. This is a learning process, just like any other development is a learning process. Will we learn as potential users try out the device? This is rhetorical questions in most cases, but you get the idea. What other kinds of analysis can we do if we're farther along into design? I've done more FMEAs. I've done FMEAs until I start regurgitating them. But that's the classic thing that most people depend on. An FMEA is a failure mode and effect analysis, where you go component by component through the engineering design and say, if this were to fail in such and such a way, what could cause that failure? What would be the harm that would result? What's the severity, the probability? What can we do about that as a mitigation? And then after the mitigation, what's the probability and severity? So FMEAs are the other way of analyzing this. I don't happen to have an example of that here, and I just turned, there we go. Or later in development, might we bring in other stakeholders, like, for example, the case law situation. So to hammer home the point even more, the idea of having team diversity raises different kinds of questions that all feed together as to why are we doing this and what can we do about it to reduce the potential risk of the device as we go along. Now, that's just one element. Regulated software-driven devices or regulated software that's standing all by itself, software as a medical device. We don't use the term standalone software anymore because that means something different to IT people, the standalone. So we talk about software as a medical device. I have worked with cases of that. You have to document what you're doing, what you're generating, what your as-built software is like. Because those documents are evidence. We have certain processes in a quality management system that result in documentation. The documentation shows that the device is, come on, pressing on the wrong thing, that the device is safe and effective. Our goal is the key part. How we get to that goal, given certain understanding of what kinds of information that the reviewer is going to be looking for, of course, the process is up to individual companies. So here are the kinds of documents that are required for document control design control in development of something of a medical device. A planning document, inputs and outputs. If that sounds like ISO 9000, that's where it came from. We go by ISO 1345, which is a derivative of ISO 9000, but it's written specifically for the medical device industry. Design reviews have to take place from time to time, and I'll talk about those in just a second. Certain kinds of validation to show that you satisfied your own criteria, but then that's verification, I'm sorry. Verification to show that you satisfied your own criteria, your own specifications. Design validation to show that you met user needs, so that a nurse or a radiologist or somebody else can use the device effectively with minimal instruction or with the amount of instruction that you're say you're going to provide. Some kind of design transfer, and then maintaining records of design changes in what is called a design history file. David?
So one of the core Agile values is we value working software. One of the core values is we value working software
Over comprehensive documentation.
This seems to flip it.
And in fact, if you look at the bottom of the manifesto, it says that we don't say that there's no value of the things on the right. It's we value what's on the left more. So let's follow a process that gets us working software so that we don't have to spend all this effort on the documentation. And I'll talk about that again in just a second. Another? So the documentation really needs to provide who, what, when, where, why, and how. But we don't want to have documentation provide some kind of a checklist. GPSV is the general principles of software validation that the FDA published in 2002. It talks about development tasks. It doesn't talk about specific sets of requirements. And we got one over here. Yes, sir.
A question on the impacts of failures in the regulated environment. Certainly have the example when it's severity 1. Bad things can happen. It looks like most recalls are severity 2 type of things. So what kind of things and impacts happen if there's a severity 2 failure, which seems to be where most of the recalls occur? What are being avoided by level 2 recalls?
Minor injury types of situations. Or let's say the device has been cleared for this and this and this function, but an oversight in developing the software allowed this further function that's available internationally but not in the US to be exercised. That would definitely be a recall. It might not be anything which would be of severe impact, but would definitely be a recall because that function that is allowed is not cleared in the US. So, I mean, those are only just a couple of general examples, but you get the idea. There are plenty of circumstances where something could be of relative, moderate impact, but be very important to take care of. This gives you an idea of how I view the document a little at a time, so that you're not consuming yourself with the documentation process, but rather getting working software going. And oh, by the way, what we're doing along the way is generating the documentation we need. So if we start out with a whole series, let me see if I can do this without pressing the wrong button, a whole series of generally described features, carve out a couple of them and do an iteration which results in something that can go into a software requirement specification, some results in information that can go into something for a design, results in something that can go into testing, because if you're doing TDD, for example, you're generating tests and you can run them repetitively and you can run them as regression tests. And then we'd carve out another group of things. And of course, having a clearly defined and clearly enforced definition of done is also very important for each one of these iterations. So we're building up these guys while we're focusing on getting good, proper, good quality software working.
So what, should I?
It's coming. We're on front.
Oh, thanks. So if I'm understanding right, we're building this incrementally, but we're also not building something that would look like the classic SRS or SDS in terms of level of detail, and some of this effectively replicates all the logic of the code. That's where it starts looking like waste. This goes back to the Agile question of how.
Let me see if this still works. If we are willing to accept something a little different from the software shall do thus and such and so on and so forth as a requirement, if we're willing to accept a statement to the effect of, as a caregiver, I want thus and such feature so that, and then call that a requirement.
Right, that's what I'm asking. Is it possible to frame these and still be acceptable as the kinds of...
That's exactly what I'm working on.
Yeah.
That's exactly what I'm suggesting. And here's another interesting part. If in that same entry, say for example, a ticket in some kind of a tracking system, whether it be Pivotal Tracker or Jira or something else, you also in a different page of that ticket define what the conditions of satisfaction are. You've shown what the tests are, and you've established traceability right then and there. Because traceability is another thing that the regulator is going to look for.
Which is great, because we're not replicating, we're not creating a document for document's sake, we're just linking them together, and this is the show.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's exactly what I'm talking about. And that's precisely the reason for this. If you use a TDD process where you write a test and then write the production code and the test passes, once you write the production code, and if you keep track of those things, you've got traceability. And, okay, in the documentation is going to show what was done. If a team is working on a set of activities, it's less important while the team is working for that documentation to serve as a communications medium. And I'll show that in a second with a slide that I borrowed from one of Nancy's presentations. It's much more important to communicate the results of that activity. And I like Jeff Patton's comment about taking vacation photos, because I think that's exactly what he's talking about. Now, this is Nancy's slide. Quite a bit of this material is taken from presentations that either she's done or we've done together. We go from a system where we're document-centric, and that's been the nature of some of these questions, where we say we're going to generate a document and then hand it to somebody else to implement. And then there are questions that always arise, to a system where we use conversations to make sure we understand things and let documents be an outcome of that. We talk about it, well, so we document things at the time that the information is generated. So project plans, yeah, they have to come fairly early, although they can be modified. Project summary absolutely has to come at the end, and certain other things are done cyclically, iteratively as we're going through development. This is the one that I wanted to get to, because this is funny. This actually came up in my client meeting this afternoon, just up the road here. I said, well, you're doing periodic demos when your outsourced developer gets to certain increments in their app. Those product demos are a design review. If you document features you went over, what action items came out of that, that's an incremental design review. You write it in a memo to file and you've got it there. Now, of course, there will always be a big design review when the product is ready to go through the process of release. Final FDA submission and release and all that sort of thing. But you should be able to get to that point and not have any surprises. You should have seen this guy's eyes when I showed him this and told him that. His eyes got really big. He said, wow, I love it. Because they've been doing these demos all along, and he was worried about how do we do design reviews. I said, you've got it in hand. Well, one of the issues that comes up is how do you get software and hardware people to work together in an agile fashion? There's no one right answer to this other than the term collaborate. You have to recognize that cycle times are different. Okay, so cycle times are different. Electrical hardware, mechanical hardware, those are going to have different kinds of cycle times from software. So understand that and make sure that you have touch points on a regular basis. Make sure that software is always being tested on the hardware underpinnings that are current at that time. So that as you get to a new release of the electrical systems, you make sure you move the software over onto that new platform as you go from a breadboard to an evaluation board to something else. I wonder, did I? So each of those junctions gives some kind of a tangible baseline point and enables peer-to-peer work. The hardware fields, the hardware people have been doing something that looks a lot like Agile for years and years. They've been building prototypes and trying out prototypes and correcting as they go along. So this is no new idea in that kind of field. It's been given a somewhat different name, and it operates on a different time scale. So recognize all of that stuff. When you've got mixed teams working together, maybe you need to have a task board that recognizes the different kinds of activities that are taking place, but puts people together in a single team, where some of those activities may correlate across that boundary of the hardware versus the software. There's no one right answer, as I said, but having conversations on a regular basis is a hell of a lot better than throwing something over the wall. Nancy's experience with a collaborative project like this, I suspect she's talked about this in this group before, but I'll go through it fairly quickly. She was involved in a team even before the term Agile existed, where they were doing development that involved hardware, new hardware, new software, new mathematical algorithms, new packaging, the whole shooting match. And she had her team on the software side of things work in short increments, doing small pieces. And because they were doing frequent releases, they had many more opportunities to improve the hardware and software interaction. So, for example, they could start monitoring voltages at suspect places because the electronics people kept saying something weird is happening, we don't know what's going on. Well, tell us where to monitor that circuit and we'll give that feedback to you. They had field problems they couldn't isolate, so the software team created special releases that allowed them to do troubleshooting. Or they had software drivers that could be separately built so that they could see if particular parts within that system were behaving correctly. So the hardware people became Agile without even really trying, without calling it that. Okay. Planning is an extremely important element as well to show the regulators you're keeping control of your process, you're keeping control of your development. So how do we approach planning without making it something that's you will do this and we will have all the ins and outs of this explicitly defined up front? How about some of the mapping techniques that have come along? Well, plans should avoid bottlenecks as a result of trying to do everything up front. And TIR 45 talks about how an Agile team will need more than a backlog and a release strategy, and they have to write formal plans, but they also have to do planning at lower levels. So summarizing that long statement, I have this concept that plans can be formal and high level with things like goals, resources, milestones, and deliverables, and then much less formal for the emergent details and specifics. In layers, so for a project, you might talk about your development planning, some high-level requirements analysis, and architectural design. For releases, and here I'm not talking about release to the field, I'm talking about internal, we're going to put this out in order to be able to test it kinds of releases. Development planning comes in there, plus a lot of things that come up in as a result of IEC 62304, which is a software quality standard that's internationally accepted. There's going to be integration and integration testing, and I hate the colors, System testing, regression testing. I had this much more brightly colored, and Nancy didn't like it, so I dialed it back to this. And software release processes, those are planning processes. And then for sprints, increments, we have another level of planning that goes even farther down. And then for individual stories, we have a series of plan levels that we talk about. That's actually as it's diagrammed out in the TIR 45 document, just colored in. This is where I defined the TENS. I should have stuck this slide in a lot sooner. Transcutaneous electrical nerve stimulation applies that oscillating electric field, and there's some kind of user input and then user information that comes out. Depending on the type of device, some kinds of devices are used just in a clinical setting. A doctor operates it. Some kinds of devices are run by the individual person, him or herself. So let's take a look. If you've ever seen Goiko Adzish's book, Impact Mapping, he talks about defining what your goal is, defining who are the key players, the key actors that will influence that goal positively or negatively. In this case, physicians, patients, regulatory bodies, and then sometimes, depending on the device, it could be support people, field technicians. What are the impacts you want to have on those on those actors, and what are the deliverables that you want to put out in order to have those impacts? So for here, just to give you an idea what that kind of mapping looks like, you want to sell 3,000 units in the first 2 years, or 2,000 units in the first 3 years. Your physicians, your patients, your regulatory body, and your support people are all going to be the actors that you want to influence. The impact for the physicians that they can adopt this kind of TENS device with confidence. The patients want to know that there's no concern about being injured and that their pain is in fact going to be relieved. The regulatory body wants to know that there's a convincing safety profile. And there are other things that you would supply if there are field people involved. I'll skip over that part. So deliverables could be for relieving the pain. It happened that we worked with creating this for something that already existed, where there was a lot of research that had gone in to generate a proprietary algorithm for producing those pulses that were the oscillating field. Highly effective. Concern about injury, fault detection during therapy, and limits on the settings that the thing could be dialed up to. For the physicians, they want to know, can I use this thing without having to read some long manual? Well, how about a prompted setup sequence? Fairly simple to devise. And there may be other things. Let's a convincing safety profile. That's part of the documentation and risk analysis that you would be generating. So the documentation is extremely important as a part of this. Now notice what's going on here. We have something that any of those people can look at and say, you missed something here, or that's not quite right. So that all stakeholders within a company can contribute to this kind of map. If we have something that's going to be serviced in the field, your field people would say, well, I'm going to need this, that, and the other thing. You want to have this impact to make it easier to service that, for example. So this is something that multiple people can contribute to. That's, again, like that multiple voices I was talking about earlier.
On this chart, you can see how the bottom line feeds to the next bottom, and that line feeds into the second. You can see each of them, where the importance is. It seems funny, though, how the actors feed into the goal, because none of those four actors, as far as I can see, have any interest or anything like that in fulfilling that goal.
I hear where you're going.
Maybe another goal, or each of them may have separate goals, but none of them have that goal.
Maybe what I should do is point from the goal to the actors, because those are the people we want to influence in order to achieve that goal. That would probably be the better way to make this clearer. Good point. I like that. there's more to the impact mapping stuff, and for example, that was a good clarification that I'll make sure that I do when I use this slide again. I've only covered a portion of what Goiko talks about. He's not interested in the FDA regulated field at all, but what he talks about can so easily be adopted for this kind of field, because I've seen marketing plans. You go, what is this telling me? What how do I, who, what, where, why, and when? With all kinds of big figures about the size of the market and all this. Let's get down to the real basics. What do we really want to do? So I think, my own personal opinion, an impact map with appropriate explanations can be used to replace that marketing justification document and be an updatable living document, because it can so readily be contributed to by all manner of stakeholders. Now, when we actually get to implementing something in software, in hardware, in a device, Jeff Patton, in his story mapping approach, this approach becomes very, very important. By making sure that the product will fit the user needs, envisioning a minimum viable product, planning different kinds of releases, and communicating among all kinds of people who are involved, all kinds of stakeholders. The story map, who here has been exposed to the story mapping concept before? A fair number of people. So I don't really need to go through things in that much detail here. Building the map by generating a sequence of events and then hanging below each of those events the kinds of features that support that event. And ranking them in different levels so that you can say, well, we're going to have these features in the feasibility release, these features in the testing release, and so on and so forth. So here we talk about one release that's for laboratory testing, one release that's for a feasibility study, one release for what's called a pivotal study. That's a final kind of a end study for user acceptance. And you notice what I've done here in this example case. We've colored in a pink color all of the features that are risk-related features, ensuring that the outputs are initially set to 0. That would be a risk-related feature. Making sure that therapy ends when the time limit is reached. That's a risk-related feature, so it doesn't just keep going. And so forth and so on. And features are lined up under the specific activities. You attach the electrodes, you power up the device, you enter the settings for the treatment, you begin the therapy, allow it to proceed where the most of the logic is taking place, and then you disconnect the electrodes when things are complete. Well, not all of these are necessarily user stories from an activity from an individual person. For example, ensure that the pulse pattern is changing as a particular characteristic of this device. That happens automatically, but still there's a user story for that. So this kind of mapping can then say, well, okay, here are the features we're going to put in this, and here are the activities that they support. And then do the same thing for the next level of development, and the same thing for the next level of development. Similarly, in a map like this, multiple stakeholders can say, oh, that's great, but you missed something. We're going to want to have such and such. Or they may want to say, we want to have something else in there. For example, a remote control. So there are going to be other things related to a remote control. But moving along from that, to kind of bring this all together, what I'd like to show is that Agile is actually entering the industry. I've shown several specific things about how to approach doing an Agile development within the regulated field. How many people are actually using this? Well, what's interesting, Nancy and I have for some years now been speaking at a conference that will move this year from Munich to Berlin that is software designed for medical devices. And we find more and more companies, more and more people are using Agile methodology there in Europe as opposed to what's happening in the US. Now, to be sure, there are US companies who are taking the Agile approach. I've run into that at GE. Philips Healthcare is very big on Agile methodology, both in the Netherlands as well as in the US. Siemens is very big on that. A good friend of ours works for a Spanish company, Systalab Software, that's a sister company to Instrumentation Labs just down the street here. Draeger Medical, which has branches here in the US. I've a couple of years attended this conference by the International Conference on Systems Engineering, or whatever it actually is, Agile in Healthcare, and the attendees there include people like Boston Scientific, Cook Medical, GE Healthcare, Medtronic. You get the idea. And they were there to share their successes. So it's not like, this is a new kind of an interesting experiment on our part. It's like, this is what it has done for us. Now, we've worked with others. In a couple of cases, I've worked with clinical trial data management companies that were using an Agile approach. I even conducted an internal quality audit for one of them. And we reviewed the Agile methods that they were using, just as kind of an informational part. Just recently, I did a week-long audit at the medical device group within a major multinational pharmaceutical company, group that's up here in Cambridge. And through the kind of education that I've gotten by being around Nancy and attending this group, I was able to ask questions like, where's your definition of done? Who can change the definition of done? How do you show that your stories actually are done? And then some other things that are related to their Agile approach. I mentioned standalone software as a medical device. Well, there's actually a company here in Alston, Brighton, that makes a piece of software that aggregates data from multiple medical devices and watch trends in this aggregate of the data and predicts the possibility of the patient going into one or another condition. Their initial indication was shock. There have been other things they've gotten the clearance for since then. They were very much an Agile shop, completely using Atlassian tools. I've worked with a couple of cases where histology and pathology were the case, and they were looking at slides that have been created, with the staining of the tissue and so forth. And there was one case, this was actually a GE subsidiary that had this big networked system where histologists would manage all the data around a particular slide, pathologists would log into another station and bring up a particular piece and look at the actual, at the image and provide their analysis of it. And in some cases, a very few cases, there were some kind of a computer-aided diagnostic taking place. Worked in the clinical diagnostics, worked with intravenous ultrasound, intravascular ultrasound, and with optical measuring systems. So we've worked with a variety of types of companies. In one case, they actually drew a diagram of their product lifecycle process. Most of this is not of great interest to this group, but what's interesting is that they were specifically in the product lifecycle process, including an Agile portion. They would have input to a project where they'd go through a certain amount of general feasibility and kind of lining up of does this make sense and all that kind of stuff, and creating an initial product backlog. Then they would have their development process, which was very distinctly Agile, where the product development backlog would get refined into individual iteration backlogs. And every time they went through an iteration, do we have enough of a product to go forward? Yes, no, we keep going. And then when all that was finished and they could say, yes, we have enough of a product, they would go into a release process, an FDA submission type of process. So what I typically have to counter when we do talk with companies is get them away from the idea of, we want to write an Agile SOP. Help me write an Agile SOP. I'm going, no, 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 you missed the point. An SOP is a cookbook. An SOP is the checklist. Rather, you want to put in place a mindset. Your checklist or cookbook needs to define what you're going to generate. And of course, helping them bridge those silos is also that real big challenge when it's a major company. We're actually working right now, Nancy and I and Dave Kramer here, working with a small company that's a startup, and they're much more receptive to the ideas of people exchanging information among each other than some of the major companies that I've worked with in the past. We need to have a high-level product vision that keeps coming back to the team via the customers or the delegates. We need to have collaboration across functions. We need to have managers that participate and run interference. Now, I haven't discussed some other things. I haven't gotten into what the standards are and what those standards cover. I didn't think that was going to be appropriate for this group, and I haven't talked about human factors other than bringing it up in passing, where I did make the point that human factors and UX are really not the same thing. They're also crucial. We do talk about those, and there are other topics that we talk about in the book as well, the scaling, some of the other things. But that's what we had, what I wanted to present about the book today, and on any other kinds of questions, I'll throw it open at this point.
From companies you've seen try to move this direction, are there very common failure modes on their first shot at trying to be Agile in this world?
One is doing an iterative process, but playing the game of defining all the requirements up front. That's a classic misunderstanding. Another one is what I just referred to. We want to write an Agile SOP. A third one would be not involving enough different stakeholders or mindsets. I could come up with a long list of stuff, but that gives you the general idea, the kind of things that we typically run into.
So what's interesting is that not getting through a clean validation cycle or verification cycle wasn't one of the top ones off the top of your head.
No, that's not one of the key things. One of the things that happened in a meeting that we held with a company out in the San Diego area, and it turned out the Agile, we were not brought in to actually help them with their Agile transition. I think that's fallen on its face. We had somebody who was a product manager who was looking at the structure involved of product owners and so on and so forth that's typical with an Agile situation. And this was being introduced to them in a great big bang. So this guy naturally said, well, where's the product manager and all of that? I don't see a place for my job.
Right.
There is a classic case of what happens in a poorly managed transition.
Thank you.
In your experience, have you seen medical devices companies work with a whole slew of so-called offshore developers?
I can't answer for offshore development. I can, however, talk about outsourced development. And in fact, I've got experience from one client right now where they have a pain relief device, a TENS type of device, like what I was talking about, but which communicates over Bluetooth with an app on the mobile phone. The mobile app developer is a contract software house out in Michigan. It's been in the Agile field for many years. I ran into them at the Agile 2007 conference, as a matter of fact. But they don't work in the regulated industry. They don't know what IEC 62304 is. My guys here in Waltham needed to show, because they have to audit all of their vendors. Well, here's a software vendor. What do we do to audit a software vendor that isn't even under FDA regulations? We decided what we would do would be go through 62304. We know what the safety classification of the app is because it cannot have any direct impact on the therapy. It's only taking data from the device. So it's a Class A application. A, B, and C are the risk levels in IC 62304. So we said, okay, what are the things? And 62304 says clearly you have to have this, you have to have this. This is applicable to Class A, this is applicable to A, B, and C, and so forth. So we went through all the things that are Class A, made a list. We said, okay, whose responsibility is this? Project plan, that's my guys here in Waltham. Code configuration management, that's the guys who are doing the development, and so on down the list. And so I went out to Michigan, sat with these guys, introduced what I had to say, why we were doing this. They were very receptive, and we went through the things that were the software developers' responsibility. They were very receptive. Now we got to see the corrections get made and some of the planned things or process written up or whatever. But doing that process made a big difference. It's like, let's translate this to mean what it means for you in your situation. In the back?
I have a question.
Oh, you got, okay.
So you touched about the SOPs. The other area that, at least in my experience, I've kind of faced some resistance in the pharma companies is around change control. How do you blend that? Because that also is a kind of SOP. That also tends to become a process that is overlaid on everything that is potentially accelerated by doing Agile at the team level. But then there's this whole big change control, design control. How do you explain that?
Change control comes out of design control, and I brought that up as part of the design control mechanism that I was talking about. In fact, this came up just the other day in talking to the hardware team working with our startup guys out of Cambridge. They said, when do we start this design control process? I said, you decide when you put the stake in the ground. You have certain feasibility things you're doing to get it to a certain point. Then you say, we're going to lock down that design and do the engineering around making that a viable design. So that's one thing, is where you have to make a decision as to where the change control starts. The second thing is having a change control mechanism that's effective while not being burdensome. And there's tons of ways of looking at that. A lot of the tools that you have available in the Agile software environment can be used as change control tools. Take, for example, a couple of companies I've worked with. The one that had the software as a medical device that was here in Alston, Brighton, plus my guys who are up here in Cambridge that are the startup company. They're using Confluence for doing their documentation. Now, as it happens, you can set privileges on particular pages within the wiki in Confluence to say that only certain people can change them. So having a mechanism around, because we created the SOPs within Confluence. So having a mechanism where you have that control within something that's relatively straightforward to work with is going to be important. I can't make it much more specific than that because it's so specific to every individual circumstance, but that's kind of the high-level view of it. Let's have a mechanism that does achieve control of changes, but which is straightforward to use. Notice I didn't say easy. Easy to change is another story, and that's a problem.
Yeah, I can see from your talk the motivation that regulated developers will have to do this and make sure they belong. Can you get companies, I don't know whether to call them quasi-regulated or virtually regulated, where if things go wrong, it can have serious consequences, but not life and limb, so they may not have formal regulations. I'm thinking maybe some financial implications, maybe bad ones and so on, but they're not formally regulated. Do you get those companies to follow this merge between Agile and very careful risk management?
I can certainly imagine that. And it doesn't take much imagination to come up with cases that would be of that ilk. I will also point out there are bad actors in the medical device field. There are snake oil salesmen out there, and recalls and actions take place every day. There are people who think they can get away with stuff that you go, come on, you don't get it. So don't think that because people are working in an FDA-regulated environment means that all of the people working in that environment are necessarily ones who follow good, proper design control. So both things happen in and out of the industry. And I've never worked under financial regulations to really know, but I would think that it's almost as heavily regulated, or at least as heavily regulated, though maybe not in quite the same way in that environment. So that I can see other kinds of cases. Take, for example, people who develop wellness apps don't have to take them through FDA clearance because wellness apps don't count as medical devices. So that thing that's counting your steps, it's your ass if it doesn't work it right, but it can't really hurt you.
Okay. Right. Okay. Can you just go back a few slides? One more. Yeah. One more. Just one more. Yeah, this one. So if you look at this, right, this is not unlike large companies and what Dave West, one of the speakers that we had a few months ago, called waters come fall, right? Which is like, yeah, we have development, only the development is iterative, which is what makes it agile, but everything else that is before development is traditional, and so is after traditional. Is this the state of the art of how agile is practiced in the industry? Because even if this is the case, it's okay, because once this happens, then they will slowly kind of get into DevOps and really constant releases and then go backward in the life cycle. But I'm just curious if this is the state of the art of agility.
You bring up 2 points there. One, I can only speculate because I haven't seen this kind of product development process for other companies that are following an agile process. But I have a feeling that those who are doing so with an agile process have some kind of upfront, we got to check, does it make sense to commit resources and time and so on and so forth to a project for this purpose? So that kind of evaluation, and then let's figure out, maybe they're using a mapping approach to establish the high-level product backlog. So I'm imagining that something similar to this is probably the case in a lot of the companies that are in the industry that I'm used to. I will answer something else there, though, because there's a very important point. You talk about DevOps. Are you willing to let features go out to the market on a device that have yet to be tested? All right, so DevOps has its place within this. Very much so. And I'm to make sure that things get out for continuous testing and for continuous evaluation. But beyond this point, beyond that point, going out to a diabetic or going out to somebody who's suffering from nerve pain in the spinal cord, that's another story altogether. But yeah, DevOps has definitely got its place in that internal testing and in evaluation process.
I had a question on the tools you use for requirements, because it seems as if a lot of the Agile tools and the Agile process, particularly with software, has a lot of implementation details and granularity that you wouldn't necessarily capture in your validation documents. And so in that, it's as if like Jira doesn't have enough layers to protect your validation documents from a lot of the noise that happens in your iterative software development.
Oh, where did I put that? Oh, that's what I wanted to go back to. One of the things that you should be able to do, and I don't know if you can, in a tool like Jira is once the implementation is done, you lock that thing down.
Yeah, I get that, but your stories are reflected in hindsight. Hindsight's 2020, and Agile supports iterative learning process from the team.
Mm-hmm.
And iterative learning in software is actually pretty messy when you pull out all those details.
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
And it's almost as if you need to have your iterative learning process and then have a separate hindsight 2020 process to write clean stories, right, that you have there. I mean, how does it work?
It sounds like a couple of people have got comments about that. You want to try, Dave?
So this is a good example of, part of the discussion before was, you've got your requirements and you've got the stories, and there's some duplication between the two. This is an example of where the difference comes in. So the story is what you want to do in that particular time slot, in that particular sprint. It's not necessarily what you end up with at the end of the day. So I worked on projects where there's just as many scientists as there are software engineers. And it's kind of the similar thing here where there is absolutely no knowing what you're going to end up with at the end of the day. So you have a story that says, okay, this component should work this way, we're going to develop this component to work that way. If it turns out that, like, hey, that didn't work out, we need to do this other thing, you have another story that says, okay, we're going to take that component and now we're going to make it work this way. So, and it actually does play into the regulatory process because, as we've talked about, is you not only need to document, what your system is supposed to do, but how you got there. So having these stories that say this used to do this, now it does that, and you're documenting what needs to get done, gives you that path. Does that
Now,
make sense?
let me take a different direction.
Then the document's far too large for anybody to take responsibility and say, yes, I reviewed it, and I completely understand what we're delivering, and I sign it.
Let me take this in a somewhat different direction because I learned this from Norman over here several years ago. Something that says, at the top level of that story should be a requirement that's general enough to define a goal.
Yes.
To define the... Now, you may have clarification stuff and how we're going to go about implementing that goal. I don't care about those things. I don't care about them. Do we have the goal? Did we reach the goal? Do we have a test that showed we got to that goal?
Two layers of this is the user goal, here's the functional goal, and then here's our implementation detail.
Sure, why not?
And unfortunately, right now, I don't think the Agile tools have enough layers for that.
I can't answer for the Agile tools. As the best I can answer is that I've seen multiple pages within a Jira story.
Jira really works best at the team level when you're working in small scale Agile. When you get to scaled Agile, and there are many methodologies, the tools that support scaled Agile support complete requirements hierarchy.
So what,
Agile Craft, Rally, version 1, and the structures capability add-on to Jira.
yeah,
Jira has an add-on called Structure.
We have another one up front here, another comment up front.
so I've actually got a lot of background with the tooling vendors, including a couple of the ones you mentioned that I've worked for 2 years. And currently I'm involved in a large company that'll be unnamed with 10,000 or so developers on Jira and Agile Craft. I've got a group of 51 teams working on coordinated stuff, and within Jira, without add-ons other than structure, we're doing exactly what you're describing. I think the key is to think about, one of the things you said is you want to remove the noise. Sorry, I can't see who I was talking to there. And in removing the noise, all of these tools have ways to tag, label, or whatever particular items. So you could very easily say, okay, we're going to evolve our stories the way Dave talked about. And we're going to tag the ones that actually represent part of this trail, so that you take out the noise of the technical implementation stories and infrastructure things and things like that, leaving you with an easy way to extract all the stuff that is functional and requirements.
And another thing that would be another way of answering that is that elements within a particular ticket, I'll call it, within something like Jira, you can select certain elements to take part in a report. So maybe you generate a report that has this, and this element, but a lot of those implementation things are in another element that's farther down that you don't select to be put out in that report that's a requirements document.
But we can't forget, when you're using Agile, often you're going for those 2-week sprints, and you're supposed to have your stories small so that they can be, everything can be completed in a 2-week sprint, and ideally the story would be pretty small. And it seems like it's breaking it down into too high a granularity.
I disagree. In fact, the same client that I met with this afternoon, he's using his Jira stories to create a requirements document. He says, "Oh, great! If I dump this out and I have these and these screenshots in there, I've got that entire requirement for that part of the app." And this has to do with the mobile app, but maybe that's not that big an application to deal with.
You could easily handle this at upper level ethics and things like that. Happy to talk afterwards. I've done this before, actually, in a regulated.
Yeah.
You got a question, John?
I would just sort of follow up.
Yeah, no,
So,
that'd be great.
I just was, we can continue this conversation.
Deliver that, they're going to read it, not necessarily everybody else who wants that.
Yes.
Thank you, Brian, and I think,
Some very good questions.
very good questions and a lot of time.